or so graphically described by the press. The country is it was pretty much destroyed in the 1980s, but it's totally collapsed since. In every respect, just about economically, it's declined sharply since the U.S. takeover, democratically in every other respect. It's now the second poorest country in the hemisphere. I should say, I'm not going to talk about it, but I mentioned that I picked up Nicaragua because it's an uncontroversial case. If you look at the other states in the region, the state terror was far more extreme. And it again traces back to Washington, and that's by no means all. It was happening elsewhere in the world too. So take, say, Africa. During the Reagan years alone, South African attacks backed by the United States and Britain, South African, U.S., UK-backed South African attacks against the neighboring countries killed about 1.5 million people and left $60 billion of damage and countries destroyed. And if we go around the world, we can add more examples. That was the war, the first war against terror, of which I've given a small sample. Are we supposed to pay attention to that or kind of think that that might be relevant? After all, it's not exactly ancient history. Well, evidently not, as you can tell by looking at the current discussion of the war on terror, which has been the leading topic for the last month. I mentioned that Nicaragua has now become the second poorest country in the hemisphere. What's the first, the poorest country? Well, that's, of course, Haiti, which also happens to be the victim of most U.S. intervention in the 20th century by a long shot, which has left it totally devastated. It's the poorest country. Nicaragua is second ranked in degree of U.S. intervention in the 20th century. It's the second poorest. Actually, it's vying with Guatemala. They interchange every year or two as to who's the second poorest, and they also vie as to which is the leading target of U.S. military intervention. We're supposed to think that all of this is some sort of accident, has nothing to do with anything that happened in history, maybe. The worst human rights violator in the 1990s is Colombia by a long shot. It's also by far the leading recipient of U.S. military aid in the 1990s, maintaining the terror and human rights violation. In 1999, Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. arms worldwide. That's excluding Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. And that tells us a lot more about the war on terror right now, in fact. Why was Turkey getting such a huge flow of U.S. arms? Well, if you take a look at the flow of U.S. arms to Turkey, Turkey always got a lot of U.S. arms. It's strategically placed, a member of NATO, and so on. But the arms flow to Turkey went up very sharply in 1984. That didn't have anything to do with the Cold War. I mean, Russia was collapsing. And it stayed high from 1984 until 1999, when it reduced and it was replaced in the lead by Colombia. What happened from 1984 to 1999? Well, in 1984, Colombia launched a major terrorist war against the Kurds in southeastern Turkey. And that's when U.S. aid went up, military aid. And this was not pistols. This is jet planes, tanks, military training, and so on. And it stayed high as the atrocities escalated through the 1990s. Aid followed it. The peak year was 1997. In 1997, U.S. military aid to Turkey was more than in the entire period, 1950 to 1983, that is the Cold War period, which is an indication of how much the Cold War has affected policy. And the results were awesome. This led to 2 to 3 million refugees, some of the worst ethnic cleansing of the late 1990s, tens of thousands of people killed, 3,500 towns and villages destroyed, way more than Kosovo, even under NATO bombs. And the United States is providing 80% of the arms, increasing as the atrocities increased, peaking in 1997. It declined in 1999 because, once again, terror worked, as it usually does. when carried out by its major agents, namely the powerful. So by 1999, Turkish terror, called, of course, counter-terror, but as I said, that's universal, it worked. Therefore, Turkey was replaced by Colombia, which had not yet succeeded in its terrorist war, and therefore had to move into first place as recipient of U.S. arms. Well, what makes this all particularly striking is that all of this was taking place right in the midst of a huge flood of self-congratulation on the part of Western intellectuals, which probably has no counterpart in history. I mean, you all remember it was just a couple of years ago. Massive self-adulation about how for the first time in history we are so magnificent that we're standing up for principles and values and dedicated to ending inhumanity everywhere and the new era of this and that and so on and so forth. And we certainly can't tolerate atrocities right near the borders of NATO. That was repeated over and over. Only within the borders of NATO, where we can not only tolerate much worse atrocities, but contribute to them. Well, another insight into Western civilization and our own is how often this was brought up. Try to look. I won't repeat it, but it's instructive. It's a pretty impressive feat for a propaganda system to carry this off in a free society. That's pretty amazing. I don't think you could do this in a totalitarian state. And Turkey is very grateful. Just a few days ago, the Prime Minister, Ecevit, announced that Turkey would join the coalition against terror very enthusiastically, even more so than others. In fact, he said it would contribute troops, which others have not been willing to do. And he explained why. He said, we owe a debt of gratitude to the United States because the United States was the only country that was willing to contribute so massively to our own, in his words, counter-terrorist war, that is, to our own massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities and terror. No other country, all other countries kind of, they helped a little, but they stayed back. The United States, on the other hand, contributed enthusiastically and decisively, and was able to do so because of the silence, servility might be the right word, of the educated classes who could easily find out about it. It's a free country after all. You can read human rights reports, you can read all sorts of stuff, but chose to contribute to the atrocities, and Turkey is very happy to they owe us a debt of gratitude for that, and therefore will contribute troops, just as during the war in Serbia, Turkey was very much praised for using its F-16s, which we supplied it, to bomb Serbia, exactly as it had been doing with the same planes against its own population up until the time when it finally succeeded in crushing internal terror, as they called it. And as usual, as always, resistance does include terror. It's true of the American Revolution. In fact, it's true of every case I know. Just as it's true that those who have a monopoly of violence talk about themselves as carrying out counter-terror. Well, that's pretty impressive. And that has to do with the coalition that is now being organized to fight the war against terror. And it's very interesting to see how that coalition is being described. So have a look at this morning's Christian Science Monitor. That's a good newspaper, one of the best international newspapers with real coverage of the world. The lead story, the front page story, is about how the United States, people used to dislike the United States, but now they're beginning to respect it. And they're very happy about the way the U.S. is leading the war against terror. And the prime example, in fact, the only serious example, the others are a joke, is Algeria. It turns out that Algeria is very enthusiastic about the U.S. war against terror. The person who wrote the article is an expert on Africa. He must know that Algeria is one of the most vicious terrorist states in the world. It's been carrying out horrendous terror against its own population in past couple of years, in fact. For a while, this was under wraps, but it was finally exposed in France with defectors from the Algerian army. It's all over the place there, and in England and so on. But here, we're very proud because one of the worst terror states in the world is now enthusiastically welcoming the U.S. war on terror and, in fact, is cheering on the United States to lead the war. That shows how popular we're getting. And if you look at the coalition that's being formed against terror, it tells you a lot more. A leading member of the coalition is Russia, which is delighted to have the United States support its murderous terrorist war in Chechnya instead of occasionally criticizing it in the background. China is joining enthusiastically. It's delighted to have support for the atrocities it's carrying out in Western China against what it calls Muslim secessionists. Turkey, as I mentioned, is very happy with the war against terror. They're experts in it. Algeria, Indonesia, delighted to have even more U.S. support for atrocities that it's carrying out in Aceh and elsewhere. Now we can run through the list. The list of the states that have joined the coalition against terror is quite impressive. They have a characteristic in common. They are certainly among the leading terrorist states in the world, and they happen to be led by the world champion. Well, that brings us back to the question, what is terrorism? I've been assuming we understand it, but what is it? Well, there happen to be some easy answers to this. There is an official definition. You can find it in the U.S. Code or in U.S. Army manuals. Brief statement of it taken from a U.S. Army manual is fair enough, is that terror is the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to attain political or religious ideological goals through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear. That's terrorism. That's a fair enough definition. I think it's reasonable to accept that. The problem is it can't be accepted because if you accept that, all the wrong consequences follow. For example, the consequences I've just been reviewing. Now, there is a major effort right now at the UN to try to develop a comprehensive treaty on terrorism. When Kofi Annan got the Nobel Prize the other day, you'll notice he was reported as saying we should stop wasting time on this and really get down to it. But there's a problem. If you use the official definition of terrorism in the comprehensive treaty, you're going to get completely the wrong results. So that can't be done. In fact, it's even worse than that. If you take a look at the definition of low-intensity warfare, which is official U.S. policy, you find that it's a very close paraphrase of what I just read. In fact, low-intensity conflict is just another name for terrorism. That's why all countries, as far as I know, call whatever horrendous acts they're carrying out counterterrorism. We happen to call it counterinsurgency or low-intensity conflict. So that's a serious problem. You can't use the actual definitions. You got to carefully find a definition that doesn't have all the wrong consequences. There are some other problems. Some of them came up in December 1987 at the peak of the first war on terrorism. That's when furor over the plague was peaking. And the United Nations General Assembly passed a very strong resolution against terrorism, condemning the plague in the strongest terms, calling on every state to fight against it in every possible way. It passed unanimously. One country, Honduras, abstained. 2 votes against, the usual 2, United States and Israel. Why should the United States and Israel vote against a major resolution condemning terrorism in the strongest terms? In fact, pretty much the terms that the Reagan administration was using. Well, there's a reason. There was one paragraph in that long resolution which said that nothing in this resolution infringes on the rights of people struggling against racist and colonialist regimes or foreign military occupation to continue their resistance with the assistance of other states outside in their just cause. Well, the United States and Israel can't accept that. The main reason that they couldn't at the time was because of South Africa. South Africa was an ally of the, officially called an ally. There was a terrorist force in South Africa. It was called the African National Congress. They were a terrorist force officially. South Africa, in contrast, was an ally. And we certainly couldn't support actions by a terrorist group struggling against a racist regime. That would be impossible. And of course, there's another one, namely the Israeli-occupied territories, and now going into its 35th year, supported primarily by the United States, been blocking a diplomatic settlement for 30 years now, it still is. And you can't have that. There was another one at the time. Israel was occupying southern Lebanon.